Coming up, the New Jersey Devils make trades ahead of the deadline. But gosh darn it, if GM Fitzgerald does not seem to be confusing and possibly irritating the fan base in the process. We break down Tyler Toffoli, we break down Jake Allen, and what it means in the short and long term for New Jersey, all coming up next. Yes, sir. It's DPL, the Devil's Puck Luck podcast, where I am one half of your hosting duo, Adam Armbrecht. Not seen here is Danny McDonough, and that might be for the best for right now because we're going to talk about Tyler Toffoli trade, obviously going to the Winnipeg Jets. We're going to talk about the just moments ago trade of Jake Allen coming into New Jersey and what it means from a high level for the New Jersey Devils. Danny and I, who you will see him later tonight, breaking this down even more extensively and probably offering a little bit more of deserved visceral reaction to the way Fitz has gone about this deadline. But him and I were going back and forth via text. He takes care of our Twitter feed over there. So he's been updating everything and doing an excellent job. And give us a follow on NJ Devils PL on Twitter if you're watching there over on YouTube. But we were going back and forth breaking down the initial Tyler Toffoli trade, which is going to the Winnipeg Jets, retaining 50% of that remaining salary, getting a second and a third round pick over the 24 and 25 draft classes. And Danny in the moment was saying, this feels like a fleece job. Like this feels like you're giving away for nothing. Now, I push back a little bit if the idea is going to be, well, in the offseason, we're going to turn around and we're going to go ahead and we're going to bring him right back into the fold. And Fitz is saying, let me get a little bit of short-term value here, understanding handshake agreement. You're going to be right back with us in the offseason. But I was also offering that perspective based on the idea that organizationally they're saying, hey, we have this low level chance of making it into one of the final wild card spot, not one of the final wild card spot. We're not going to push all of our chips in here. We're not going to really sacrifice too much. And we're going to go ahead and just kind of recalibrate ourselves this off season. But then you get this Jake Allen trade from Montreal, which is 50% retention on the Canadian side, and then a conditional third round pick that can convert to a second based on games played. 33-year-old goaltender who, by the way, you go over, not that anyone needs the numbers here, but on this season right now, 365 goals against, 892 save percentage. You go over his run here with the Canadians. I mean, 907 was his best in year one in terms of save percentage. It's only gone basically the wrong direction since then, and the goals have skyrocketed. Now, who's playing in front of him, all that good stuff, et cetera, et cetera. He is a veteran backup goaltender primarily that's going to come in here in the mix with Nico Daws, we assume, down the stretch of this season. But I don't really understand. This is where it got me confused now. Why bring this player in the door at this point? Why send out the conditional draft pick when it's not the goaltender anyone wanted, right? This is not the move that Devils fans have been crying out for weeks, months, nay, the entire season, going all the way back maybe the last offseason as well. So it feels like Fitz is doing this dance on both sides of the line because I don't need to bring in this level of goaltender right now in this moment for the New Jersey Devils. I can play out the season with Dawes, with Schmid, with Vitek. It doesn't matter because, by the way, whatever you think is going on with the Devils from an organizational perspective on the goaltending, which I'll touch on here in a second because there has been some speculation about how they utilize their analytics and value the player between the pipes to make a move. To make a move like this is to also short-sightedly not address the other key factor here, which is what's going on in front of the goaltending. And we understand. You go look at Vitek's numbers, you go look at Schmid's numbers. The drop-off is clear from a year ago to this season. They were top 4 in goals, average goals 4 per game last season. They're still top 10 in that category. They were solid in goals against a year ago, and now have absolutely plummeted to the near bottom of the NHL. So why make a move like this? Maybe there's another one coming here, and Danny's going to be covering that, as I won't be able to look into some of the updates that are coming through in real time in this moment. But it just feels like now this is a GM that is trying to pull at different levers here, and it does become somewhat clear that whatever proactive nature he could have brought towards this deadline, he didn't. You kept playing out the string, kept waiting a little bit longer. And as other moves get made and as other draft capital gets thrown around the league, you start to take a step back and say, well, if you were going to move Tyler Toffoli, you should have done it a week ago, 2 weeks ago. You should have struck while the iron was hot. You should have been one of the first teams to be making trades as opposed to one of the teams letting the market settle out here. Now, again, In the end, I think we'll go to this off season and we'll look at the moves that they make and we'll try to assess this thing in totality. But right now, a perspective that I brought a couple of episodes ago, maybe a week or two ago, was that last season is incredible. You go on this run, you beat the Rangers, and we feel like the window is starting to be opened. And all the pundits around the league believe that too, because the Devils were among the cup contenders entering this season. Did the New Jersey Devils believe that internally? Wholeheartedly enough, where if they did, would they have gone and made that all-in move for a goaltender to make sure that they cemented that key position for themselves? Would they have gone and figured out something differently inside of the defensive pairings to make sure that you shore up any of the weaknesses you feel like you have in this run? Now, there's injuries that happen. Obviously, Dougie Hamilton goes down. Jack Hughes misses time. They're all of these things. But in the end, that's the only, whether or not I think it's the right agenda, wrong agenda, that's the only perspective that I can bring to this that makes it feel like this is why you hadn't seen a more active and more committed organizational shift towards bringing in key pieces here along the way. If they thought, hey, we don't want to sacrifice young talent, we don't want to give up a lot of draft capital here, so we're going to hedge ourselves a little bit. Fan base does not want to hear that, and I can understand why. But at the same time, right? Like it does feel like the whatever version they came into the season with, they were willing to stay committed to that. And then when you got through now you get to the deadline and you see that this team is having some struggles here, keeping themselves in that playoff picture, keeping themselves in the wild card picture. You try to make some value decisions. So again, at the top, Tyler Toffoli to the Jets. You get a second and a third, then you rewind it back, a 50% contract retention there. Remember from the year prior when they acquired him, sending out Sharon Govich. And that, by the way, is the other side of that deal that factors all into it. So I'll continue to feather in just some things that Danny and I were discussing. But again, you'll see him in here and then we'll find out. I feel like I am setting the table. I'm laying out the cloth. I'm putting down the forks and knives, the plates, the cups. I'm getting, a little bit of hors d'oeuvres out there. I'm setting that table. And then Danny's going to come in and he's going to start smashing glasses off the walls. The tablecloth is going to be doused in wine and he's going to be, calling out for bloody murder. And I'm not saying that judgmentally. I'm saying that, as you know, on DPL, I try to bring a little bit of the more reserved perspective, and Danny is going to give you probably where a lot of the fan base is right now. So if you want a little bit of that action, a little bit of that traction, be sure to come back in later tonight, because Danny has looked at this and looked at Fitz and does not feel like this organization has handled this season, maybe in totality, remotely the way they should have. So there's that part of that coming here. But remember that you send out a 25-year-old in Sharon Govich to acquire Tyler Toffoli. My big thing too, and I think that Danny would probably agree with here as well. If in the end, so I said putting out players on rentals, knowing you're going to bring them back, I'm okay with that. So there is kind of a lower floor for me about what I would take back for a player if I expect to get them back in the offseason. But when you couple it with making a move for an additional goaltender, then at that point, I do associate the relative draft value of a second and third over 24 and 25 versus keeping your number one goal scorer this season in the building and just saying, yeah, we understand this season's going to unfold the way it is, but we feel comfortable in playing this out, bringing in a less than stellar goaltender into the fold and seeing what happens over the remainder of the year. So I can debate those merits. What I have a hard time with is understanding if Fitz is coming or going here. That's what it just feels like to me. Why bother making this Allen move? What difference is that going to make? Now, he may come in and you may see a spike and you may believe that from a system standpoint, he's going to fit better in and you're going to see a spike in his save percentage. He's going to get you a couple of wins here. It's going to feather in with Nico Dawes. Maybe you're preparing for something else when it comes to that goaltending room in the big picture and you want to have him in the building already. Okay, fine. But it's not going to make the fan base happy. I'll tell you that right now. It's not going to change the narrative that has been building behind the GM and whether or not he had his finger on the pulse of what was happening with this team and what might need to get done. As everybody knows, for the most part, contextually, we understand this season had some big injuries. I mentioned Dougie Hamilton. It had some key off-ice issues. Mikey McLeod, we understand, right? So that's going to alter and change the way this team is constructed. But if you're going to make decisions and moves, it doesn't have to be in season this year or at the deadline. But if you were going to, then you need to find a way to shore up these defensive pairings because they've been haphazard. They've had a high level of difficulty here getting themselves into rhythm. Danny will tell you he feels like Luke should have been sat down at least for a game or two here along the way as he's struggling through his first full NHL season. The pairings have not always worked well. We know Lindy Ruff has been fired. So all these things are happening. It has been by far the biggest flip of the script in terms of expectations entering a season to where we stand now at the trade deadline. Even in a Danny and I talked about this ahead of the year. Even in a worst case scenario, we said knock on wood, right? Injuries and health. Well, okay, we got bit by injuries. But even with that, I think that we still had the perspective of, yeah, man, if things break a little bit bad for them and some injuries come into play, okay, we may be talking about a team that could be staring down the barrel of an early playoff exit, right? Would it have been shocking if they had a kind of Rangers-like role where they had a very successful regular season, got in there, and maybe got snake bit by a team that was on a bit of a surge? No, that still would have been disappointing in its own right. But if you had health and continuity throughout the year, you would have felt differently about it. So it's been one of those seasons that it isn't the worst of all worlds, but it is among, in terms of critical things that have not gone their way, right? It's happened. You lost Jack for a significant portion of time. You lost Dougie Hamilton, right? Long-term IR. You also had an off-ice issue for a key player who, even though he's a lower line pairing, he had been elevating his game and was becoming more critical, especially as some injuries unfolded. And then we look back and we reflect on some of the decisions made around a Tyler Toffoli. I don't know if I'm very curious to see if the fan base, if you backtrack this thing and say, like, maybe you just didn't need to trade Sharon Govich at all. Like maybe adding the pick and him to get Tyler Toffoli wasn't worth it. The production of Tyler Toffoli seems to be there. But when you go and make these moves and then you have glaring issues in goaltending, glaring issues in defense, it just doesn't feel like it's an organization that took the right stock of where they needed to make some slight adjustments in this past offseason to ensure that last year was not a mirage, that it was the first step in a building block of this team being successful, being deep playoff competitive, year over year playoff presence, obviously in the Eastern Conference. So that would be where my concern level rises there. One other note that we've been hearing rumors about, and I think Daniel might bring this up as well, but we'll talk about it as the season progresses and as we get to the offseason, that the analytics for the Devils may not value goaltending. And that may be evident with the goaltenders that they've had this season. And if you are devaluing that position, I then am curious if you're also devaluing the defensive position as well, because there's some world here where the belief is that we will overpower teams with our offense, right? And then you can even throw in the wrinkle, and Danny and I talked about this throughout the year, not the most physical team in the world. And it's not about, and Danny, we had to redefine this for one another, not about getting into fights, not about blowing guys up on the ice, just playing physical on the boards, right? Puck possession, puck control, playing in the neutral zone. This team is not particularly strong in some of those areas. We saw some players start to build up that physical presence over the course of the season. So now we're listing 1 and 2 and 3 areas of concern. If 100% healthy, then yeah, I think this mantra of we will outproduce teams on the offensive end, and that will lead to us not only be able to win more games than not, but also come back in games more often than not if we're trailing, if we're down. We know what they did a year ago, and it just hasn't translated the same way this season. You're seeing how injuries impact this roster. And I think more teams around the NHL could point to what their safeguards are in terms of if you're going to lose a player for a short or long-term amount of time and how they can adjust themselves and still be successful. I think the Devils we're realizing one of the more volatile constructs in terms of if you take out some key players here, we're just not going to be able to supplement production like that consistently and cover up for some of the deficiencies here that we've had with this team. So that being the case, just resetting the table here briefly, reminding everybody, get yourself over to Devil's Puck Luck on YouTube, turn on the alerts. Danny will be going, maybe not live. I won't put that pressure on him, but he certainly is going to be in recording later tonight and just extending this discussion and further highlighting where the deadline goes here. By the way, in case you want to hear from Danny McDonough, let's talk about him. The Allen trade is a lateral move, and if the plan is for him to be the backup next year, I think we all would be okay with that. You hope for the best, but his numbers, even on a bad team, are pretty bad. Yeah, and I think that is, oh, hold on a second too. And by the way, breaking news, Danny is going live, Adam. This guy's not scared. He's not like Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald a little scared at the deadline. Danny McDonough not scared. He'll be live later tonight as well. And just to what Danny's bringing up there, obviously, and this is how our show works, right? One host goes live, the other guy's there. Even if he physically can't be here, you'll still be hearing his voice. That the Allen move to me again, like, and Danny and I will probably debate this going forward. Hey, the backup goalie next year, okay. Is that uh, is that good? Is that good enough? I mean, and it doesn't matter. Like, does it matter if Akira Schmid or Nico Dawes or whoever's going to be the backup? It still matters who is your number one netminder. And I understand you weren't going out clearly and getting a player of that caliber at this trade deadline. So we'll see. The Allen thing is kind of a little bit marginal. I will say, though, for a 33-year-old that may be the backup next year, when you look at his save percentages and you wonder what it'll look like if the Devils reconstruct themselves a little bit and his numbers could be a bit stronger, sure. But if I get even by NHL standards, if I get a third round draft pick that give up a third round draft pick that can convert to a second, I know, and this is more of a me personally, like, why do I want to give up a converted second round pick because he potentially plays X number of games a year from now? And for what? I can find a Jake Allen. I can find dozens of Jake Allens. Like, there's no shortage of goaltenders that can give me sub 900 save percentage and 365 goals against. And even if those numbers come down to 3.5 and 907, as we mentioned some of his stats from a few years ago, okay, I can go find that guy. Like, I can believe in the open market finding a player like that more than I really care about making this move now. We'll see, though. Like we say, we'll see. Even as Danny mentioned, a bad Canadiens team, like, let's see what happens when he gets in near the fold, see if he gets on the ice and what that looks like. But this actually, more than the initial Tyler Toffoli trade, got my wheels turning a little bit on where the Devils are, where is Fitzgerald, and what is the ultimate agenda. We're not going to know this in the short term. We're going to have to wait to see. And shout out to everybody that's in here. I'll throw up a handful of what we're getting here in the chat, whether you're on with us on YouTube or over on Twitter. Appreciate everybody being in the door. And here you go. Just as a starter here, JP came in with stopgap, price too high, Habs stink. He'll play better in New Jersey. Yeah, that's fine, right? Like, I think that's a fine page to be on with him. Again, I just don't know if I'd bother making this deal right now at this point of the season if you don't think that it's going to matter relative to trying to quote unquote chase down the final wild card spot or not. If we move down the list here a little bit, because I saw Jeff come in the door here. Let's talk about it. Analytics move here, but I don't see him being any better behind New Jersey Devils D. Right. So I mentioned that there as well. Just now, again, this is where going back to the top in the Tyler Toffoli trade to the Winnipeg Jets, you end up retaining 50% of the salary, second and third round pick over 24 and 25. This is where every move, you need the full picture here, right? And it doesn't mean that you'll love every decision on an individual level, but you need to know what's going to happen going forward here. Will Jake Allen, or any goaltender for that matter, be more productive and play better if we see a little bit of a margin move in the defense? Danny and I also talked about this, and I'm going to leave him to highlight some of the names that he wants to get into. But when we talk about what this team needs, obviously goaltending, but I already said, and Danny and I were texting about this, I want two new defensemen introduced into the pairings this offseason that are going to better balance out Luke, right? And better help Ball as well, who we think is taking a nice step forward here, but needs to continue his development. I need to reconstruct the defensive pairings. Danny rightly mentions, need another center into this team here, right? Can be a third line guy. Lazar's nice, but you want him down on the fourth, right? So I already have three kind of somewhat critical adds that I need here to go along with the goaltender. And you can get all those things done. But I will be curious to watch to see what happens when we come to Tyler Toffoli. And if my assumption that, well, I'm getting a little bit of draft value here because I'm going to bring him right back in the offseason, okay, fine. But then I need to watch every other move that you make. I can be okay with making that decision now and bringing him back in the offseason, but not if we find out in the offseason that player X or Y is not brought back on a contract, that defensive targets are not acquired in the offseason because you've allocated to keep another offensive weapon, as good as he may be, in the room here, as opposed to making sure you get this roster balanced out a little bit more. Jeff here, just tuning in. Sorry if oh, no. All good, Jeff. Yeah, resetting this real quick here. We'll stay on for another handful of minutes before I have to get out the door. The whole reason being, I can't be here later. And Danny can't be here now. But what you end up with is full coverage, wall to wall, table setting, and then total destruction. That's what we're giving you here. Toffoli, obviously, for anybody, to the Jets. second and third round picks, 24 and 25, 50% retention, and then 50% retention from the Habs, sending Allen in with a third round pick, can convert to a second round pick based on games played. So we'll see how it plays out. I don't entirely know how to feel about it, but I will offer this, as we'll bring up Jerome here real quick too, who joined in on the chat. Devils fans aren't happy with the trades today, but would have been happy if they traded Holtz, Mercer, and 3 first-rounders for a 34-year-old goalie. Yeah, I think, and Danny and I have talked about, trying to make it for the guy you want. We won't even dare speak his name at this point. And I said I wouldn't. Danny and I text about this, and he can flesh it out later too. I was not going to. Now, Holtz and Mercer and 3 first-round picks. I know you're being tongue-in-cheek, Jerome. But talking about for a rental the remainder of this season for a 34-year-old goaltender, I did not want to see the Devils really mess with the apple cart too much here in terms of the young talent. Now, we already heard Fitzgerald come out and speak about Alexander Holtz and talk about his game. Listen, you go look at the numbers and you combine the eye test. There are things wanting a two-way player and the responsibilities. But I was a little surprised at, I'll say a little bit, how heavy-handed the commentary was, because it just seems to carry over this disconnect of where Alexander Holtz is within the organization and where they perceive him going forward, right? So he certainly is maybe going to be a piece here. And if we find out in the offseason a move gets made, and maybe relative to where they were at this deadline or well ahead of this deadline, you could have moved Holtz and a pick and acquired player X. I would have liked to have seen that too. Again, recalibrating and balancing this roster is really what we're trying to do here. Danny, I can't put up the comment. You mentioned him by name. I'm not allowed to do it. It's like saying Voldemort out loud here. You dare not speak it. Oh, I'll still throw it up in a second here. But in the end, that's I think the disconnect here a little bit too. And it is fine. Dan and I debate these things. How much would you? How much of your future would you sacrifice to make the move in the short term? I look at it as, if you're acquiring a player that you believe gives you multiple season value, multiple season high-end value, then you start to have the discussion about which young players are you willing to sacrifice, how much draft capital are you willing to sacrifice. I also am of the mindset that if you believe in young talent within your organization and it's there now, I'm more willing, or I have more of an appetite to sacrifice future draft capital as opposed to the young players, because you can still develop them, still bring them along and figure out where they're going to fit, or utilize them down the road in another potential move or trade to strengthen your roster. So all these things play a big factor in how we approach it. The other and maybe last note that I'll make here, which is a little bit of the tempered discussion about this, and this goes true, it was true about Lindy Ruff too, right? There was a segment of the fan base that said he shouldn't have been the coach a year ago, even, before they had their success. He shouldn't have been the coach at the start of this season, and that he should have been fired and was fired. And I said, it got to a point, right? You lose the locker room, the team doesn't seem motivated. You're maybe questioning some of the decisions in terms of rotations. What's the organizational perspective versus what Lindy Ruff wants to do? And even Green in the interim, you're already hearing just the way that he speaks about it seems a bit more, and he's trying to showcase himself as well, a bit more determined, a bit more convicted in the way that he's speaking about players and the tone that he's setting. And maybe Lindy just didn't have the appetite for that down the stretch. But, if you had an opinion about Lindy before last season, and then they go on the run that they do, you have to allow it to impact it. If you believe that Fitzgerald made a ton of amazing moves a year ago, or, before this season began, and now you're questioning some of these, well, they need to fall into the same bag. It all needs to fall in and develop a total perspective. So sometimes in the moment and in the short term, you want to question and wonder what the heck is going on here. But is there a big picture? And we won't know. That's the big part of this, is we won't know until the deadline passes, until we get to the offseason, until the moves get made. And some of these things may be pivots. Like, he may have had an agenda and then gone a different direction. They may have had a plan coming in, and then injuries changed their perspective. They may have wanted Alexander Holtz to be a certain caliber of player, and he never got to whatever expectations they had, and now they have soured on him. All of these things matter in the way that we look at short-term trade deadline decisions, long-term roster construction decisions, and ultimately what's going to be an offseason that we anticipate bringing in a new head coach, having some tweaks into the system, obviously off of that, and then potentially seeing some real turnover into the way that this roster in totality is constructed. Now that the appropriate amount of time has passed, we will let you know that Danny says Markstrom has term and would be our number one for the next few years. But Adam and I agree price point was probably too high for him for Fitz to make that move. Our focus now should be on Olmark in the offseason. So, yeah, I mean, we talk about this, and Danny and I are, he's right. I don't know if the 34-year-old for the next 2 years, what is that window, right? What's the top 4? I think it is in every statistical category. When you talk about where he was, is that worth X, Y, and Z? TBD, right? And in some ways, I would say, is it worth it to be a mid-level playoff team, to be a Eastern Conference Final playoff team, to be a Stanley Cup Final team, right? It's all relative to that as well. So in that regard, that's up for debate, and it's fine, and we can have all those discussions. But I do want to see what happens for this team going forward, for this team in the offseason. And then, oh, by the way, like as low as the percentages may be, and we'll take a quick look here on and Danny will probably have this on the tip of his tongue. At the playoff odds before we get out the door here. See if the Devils, where have they moved to here? By the way, in case you're wondering, the Panthers 100% chance, Vancouver 100% chance. It's a shame. A lot of teams have a 100% chance, but the Rangers still have a 0.02% chance to miss the playoffs. So how about that? We're going to see them coming up here shortly. The Devils, come on! We just skyrocketed to 17.7% chance to make the playoffs. What is the problem here? It was only 7.5% before the last win, and it was only 3.5% before that. That means, if my math is correct, 2 games from now, it's going to be back up to 40%. We're going to be right back in that wild card discussion. We're got nothing to worry about, right? So, see, look now, Danny. See, look now. He says 8.8 before last night's game, assuming close to that. Still right, but sorry, Danny. We're pushing 18% now. We're 18%ers, baby. That's almost 20% of the time. Yeah, well, and it's probably true that the math isn't quite mathing. I'll give you perspective here. This is over on moneypuck.com. Before we close out, Tyler Toffoli to Winnipeg Jets, third and second rounder, 24 and 25, 50% contract retention. Jake Allen brought in from the Habs, 50% contract retention, conditional third round pick that can convert to a second based on number of games played. Other team, like if we're sniffing around it, Calgary Flames, 18.8%. I'm rolling through both conferences here. Don't worry about that. 20.8 for Minnesota. Behind us, Pittsburgh, 10.7% chance. How about that? 9.8 for Washington, only 2.8 for the Blues. The Devils just beat, and then you get out of it. Basically, the Devils, in terms of teams that have, anyone above 0%. The Senators still have a 0.1% chance to make the playoffs. So Senator fans, just keep holding strong. It's not over yet. 1.2 for Buffalo. 2.8 for St. Louis, 9.8 for Washington, 10.7 for Pittsburgh, and then the New Jersey Devils at 17.7 right now. So they are only 6th worst in terms of chances to make the playoffs by any margin of a team that has above a 0% chance. That being the case, Danny will be back in later, continuing to further this discussion. He'll reiterate the parameters of all the trades, what it looks like if anything else happens to come down the way here once we get off air. He'll, of course, continue to break those down as well. We'll quickly here, hit up a couple of these here. Let's see what happens against the Canes tomorrow. Yeah, by the way, Danny and I are going to be at that game. We are doing little peek behind the personal life curtain. We are going to the Devils game at 12:30 at the Rock. And then we're going to have a heck of a time out in and around Newark and Harrison, because at night we're going to the home opener for the New York Red Bulls taking on FC Dallas. So we're just going to be living the dream in and around the New York Harrison area tomorrow. And yes, it's supposed to be 40 degrees and downpouring by the night. It's not going to stop us. We're going to continue to have a good time regardless. Last one from Jerome, 70% of the time, the Devils are a playoff team every time. Yeah, right. This is not the math is not mathing, as Danny McDonough would say. This is 17% of the time, the New Jersey Devils make the playoffs 100% of the time. If that maths. So listen, this is what this season has been, right? Sometimes you got to have a chuckle to avoid really getting into the mire of what has gone wrong for this team and some of the questions that are being asked now up the chain of command inside of this organization. Last one here from Santor. Here's where your question fits. We needed help in the net weeks ago, more like months ago, and to make a coaching switch on Monday, it's the thing that is head scratching. I'm assuming that's what that was there. The thing that's head scratching. Yeah. And that's really the biggest thing that I think indictment that we would put at Fitz's feet is just what was the intention here, right? When did you believe that this season was starting to go in a direction you didn't want it to? And when inside of that discussion, did you make the decision about what it was going to be? Do we want to be competing this year? Do we want to try to turn this thing around? Or are we just kind of playing it out? That's going to be frustrating to the fan base to kind of sacrifice a season. That I can appreciate, but I can understand it, right? I can understand pushing the pause on how much you want to dedicate into this year, not wanting to sacrifice the future to try to make this push because maybe you feel like injuries and otherwise and some miss expectations, but between the pipes, you just said, hey, listen, for us to go crazy here and try to fix this problem is going to be far more damaging in the long term than maybe what we believe the short-term gain is. 17% chance to make the playoffs. They maybe said, hey, it doesn't really increase our chances to have that deep playoff run that we were hoping for if we go all in here. And maybe it takes us from being cup contenders at the 70th and 80th percentile over 2 and 3 seasons and brings us down to 50, brings us down to 40, whatever the numbers may be, right? All those things are going to play a factor here. Timing, Mitchell, I apologize. That was pretty obvious. I could have pieced those things together. Nevertheless, we're going to get into all of this not only later tonight with Danny McDonough. We'll also maybe, if we have time, as I mentioned, very busy day tomorrow. Maybe we'll come in tomorrow morning. And with the way we're getting some traction here, over 150 people in enjoying the live, do a couple of things for us in a big way. One, turn on the alerts. So if we go live tomorrow, you get to be a part of it. We want you to be a part of it. We want to have the conversations with you. And then beyond that, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Follow us over on Twitter. As I said, Danny really helming up the DPL Twitter handle. So he's doing an excellent job keeping everybody tapped into what's going on and offering perspectives on it. Follow us at Danny the Face, at Adam Armbrecht. Help us move the needle on this little engine that could. We're looking to do big things in the years to come. So really appreciate it. Appreciate everyone in here as well. Thank you, Jerome. Really, of course, man, you guys come in. This is a part of what this is. It's about not only being representative of how we feel about the team, offering high level and fan base perspectives, but elevating your guys' voices as well. So that being the case, guys, Tyler Toffoli out, Jake Allen in, just like we all anticipated for the New Jersey Devils. Danny will be back later tonight, continuing to break down the deadline, and he will offer a more league-wide perspective. All the moves that went down, maybe some of the price points, and where Fitz and the Devils should have been more active trying to get into the mix. Spirit in the Sky, awesome channel, awesome handle. We'll see you guys next time right here on the DPL podcast.